I mentioned at the beginning of the semester that every Old Testament scholar, I think, wants to do a commentary on the book of Job. We all tend to have our thoughts on it. It's celebrated and considered special really across Christendom and even in scholarship as well. It's really, truly a remarkable book that defies easy interpretation. And I think that's one of the things that draws people to it, is that it is so complex. It's been described as the greatest poetic work ever produced by the Israelite community, and that greatness extends to its honesty, what it's willing to say, its perception, the insights into what it says, and the expression of it. Most of the book is complex and beautiful poetry, and the way it expresses it is pretty remarkable. Its origins are a mystery, though. It might be a traditional Edomite story. Some of Job's friends do come from places that are traditional Edomite locations. And there was an association of wisdom with Edom, so there might be a little bit of that going on. It could be a traditional Israelite story. It could be a traditional Babylonian story. There have been stories that have been found that might mirror a righteous person suffering. I tend to fall in line with nobody really knows. I don't really know when this book or where this book originates. I don't really know how far this book goes back either. Most scholars agree that the book came together over a very long period of time, but no one knows how far back it goes or how long it took to reach its final form. It has been associated with various authors in the Talmudic tradition, Moses, Jacob, the Persian period, maybe sometime before the First Temple. A range of dates have been given for the origin of this story. The book itself is a little unique in its organization. It is bookended by two narrative sections. You have chapter 1 and 2 are narrative material which introduce the story, and chapter 42 is a narrative closing of the story. But most of the book, from chapter 3 to chapter 41, are a series of poetic speeches. Job, Job's friends, and ultimately God. Spoiler alert, at the end of the story, God does show up. So really interesting in its composition. The book does have some extra Job references, in other words, references outside the book of Job within the Bible. Ezekiel 14 lists Job as a righteous individual. Ezekiel 14:12 says, "The word of the Lord came to me, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, these three, were in it. They would only save their own lives by their righteousness, says the Lord God." We're in Judah at the time. So Job is considered a righteous person by Ezekiel. I should point out all three of those individuals are, real quick, Daniel. Dan-el is not Daniel that you would know from the book, most likely. Probably that is a reference to a much older story, maybe even a story that we see in Canaanite literature, the tale of Akkad. Daniel was considered a righteous individual. He was out looking for his son. And Noah, that would mean Noah, Daniel, and Job would all be three ancient, non-Jewish, righteous individuals. That would keep them in parallel. The Daniel of the text would have been a contemporary of Ezekiel and be an unusual person to find in that list. So probably that's a different, if not the Daniel in the Tale of Akkad, at least a different Daniel than the Daniel that we're probably thinking of. But that's one mention of Job. The other more famous one probably comes from the book of James, where James talks about the patience of Job or the endurance of Job. Now, when we look at the book of Job, what you will find is that is not a word that you associate with Job, either patient. Job is up in God's face several times and very demanding. And so one wonders, why is James using this word patience? I believe that James, you could believe he's being ironic, making some sort of, you've heard the patience of Job. I don't know that that's the best interpretation. More than likely, he's referring, in my mind, to another story of Job. We're not the first people to start adapting stories of Job in the movies and books. But in the first century BCE, there was a book called the Testament of Job. And in the Testament of Job, he is celebrated, the character of Job is celebrated for his patience. An angel shows up at the beginning and tells him to be patient. He's enduring all through because of his patience. And the word of patience and endurance is a word that occurs several times in that telling of the book of Job. So I wonder if James isn't referring to that telling of the book of Job and not the canonical story of the book of Job, which shows a very less patient Job at the end of the story. At the end of the day, I don't know. But I do find it an interesting parallel that you get with that Testament of Job and patience and the book of James. A couple of things right off the bat in Job that we should probably mention. Right at the very beginning, we notice there are these sons of God that come to present themselves before the Lord. You might remember from Introduction to Old Testament that Hebrew doesn't have a word, a special designed word for the word angel. Typically, the word is messenger, and it's up to the translator or the reader to determine whether or not that's a divine messenger or a human messenger. It's just malach. But every now and then, when you want to make absolutely clear that you're talking about a divine being, Hebrew will use the phrase son of God. So don't get too twitchy about this. Obviously, if you come from a Christian perspective, son of God has a particular meaning. But in the Old Testament, sons of God or son of God was just used to denote a clearly divine being, what we would think of as angels, attendants of God. In fact, some Bibles will actually translate sons of God into angel, just to make sure there's no twitchiness from Christians that might read the text. So it's just a shorthand for divine being. But then something strange happens when these sons of God come to present themselves before the Lord. Most Bible translations have, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. Now, this translation of Satan is an unusual one. First of all, you've got some readings on Satan and the origins of Satan, and those are listed on the website. But it is a weird phrase that we have here. First of all, it's not the proper name. It is, in Hebrew, Hasatan. It has the definite article attached to it. And it is an unusual characterization for Satan, at least the Satan we've come to know in the New Testament that's tempting Jesus and playing that role in Revelation. Here in Job, you don't have that kind of, that characterization that you're used to. There's no, seeking whom he may devour. In fact, when God asks where Satan has been, he just basically says, walking around on the earth, just, it's almost hanging out is his answer back to God when God asks where he's been. And this notion of a regular appearance in the presence of the Lord to give some sort of annual report for his goings on, that's a new one. That's a different one. Another interesting thing about it is he completely disappears from the book in chapter 2. In fact, the book of Job says, and Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And I also say, and right out of the book of Job, because he's gone after this part of the story. So I've often wondered what to do with this Hasatan, particularly since it's not a name. It's actually got the title along with it. And I've often wondered if perhaps we don't have a translation issue going on here. Now, no major translation out there preserves the definite article. You won't find any Bible that you would buy in a Christian bookstore that has the Satan in there. Most of them leave that title out. I've often wondered if perhaps that title, Hasatan, is not a proper name and not the person we think of. In fact, the verb Satan is used several times in the Old Testament and not used in reference to that typical personification of evil we normally think about. Perhaps Hasatan, the noun form of it, is a title for some divine being who has a responsibility that reports to God, who's supposed to be testing the motives of people, and actually gets upset with God because God's policies, it seems, is making his job harder. At least that's what he says. And I wonder if perhaps we shouldn't translate it a little more literally instead of translating and putting in a proper name, which isn't in the text, actually translating it something like the accuser or actually prosecuting attorney is probably the healthiest way to think about it, with that sense of an individual whose responsibility it is to make sure that things are being followed and people's motives are being tested. And we find that at the end of the day, that's really what's at stake there. But however you want to handle that situation, however you want to think about Hasatan there in the book of Job, a couple of things that I think are important to note. And that is, first of all, that Satan is not the focus of the book of Job at all. The character of Job does not see Satan as his enemy. In fact, Job, that character several times makes it clear that God is his adversary. And by the time we come to the speeches of God at the end, God owns that it's God who is having and doing these things. In fact, in Hebrew, the name Job is the name that means enemy or adversary in this book. The book of Job, I think, makes very clear this is not a contest between God and Satan at all. The contest, if there is one that exists in this text, is between God and Job. And Hasatan plays a very minor role and disappears way early in the story, never to come back into the story. So some thoughts as we look at the book of Job on how the early narrative forms.